Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 21, Water in the Tent. Basic scientific concepts existed in this world. Eat, drink, sleep. Work out, labor, rest. However, something that both shocked and puzzled Kant happened right before him. A Jack Allen tribe of such a huge scale was not anywhere near an oasis with an abundance of water. It was right there in the middle of nowhere in the desert. Even more baffling was that they were able to thrive for generations under such conditions. Upon seeing that, Kant's jaw almost dropped to the ground. Kant pursed his lips a little. In a subdued voice, he said, "Maybe there's water around here." "No, there is no water whatsoever." The desert bandit shook his head, instantly disagreeing with Kant's suggestion. He looked at the surrounding dunes. In a serious tone, he said, "If there is some sort of underground water source around these parts, there would be drought-resistant plants here. If you look around carefully, my lord, you'll find nothing of the sorts around here. Nothing but a vast ocean of sand surrounded them." Kant narrowed his gaze on the tribe. "How is such a massive Jack Allen tribe able to survive here?" he asked with a rather heavy tone. The desert bandit shook his head and replied, "I have no idea." "Well, they can't just be able to drink by eating sand, can they?" Kant looked on with a grim expression. The mass of messy tents was right there before his eyes, including a large number of Jack Allens. All of that made him look extremely glum. It was a force that could easily crush his fledgling Trondheim. He took a deep breath and quelled his emotions. They definitely have a water source somewhere. Yes, there has to be a water source. Kant was sure of that. If there was no water around somewhere, the Jack Allens would not have built their tribe in such a place. No creatures wanted to simply die. That even applied to these primitive Jack Allens. "Look, they're cooking now." The desert bandit's words prompted Kant to turn his gaze. It was evening, so it was time for dinner. That much was the same with the Jack Allens. Many aged Jack Allens came out of their tents. Pieces of torn dried meat were being distributed by female Jack Allens to the others around them. It seemed that all property belonged to the tribe. Even food was distributed from a single source. That likely included the most precious commodity in the desert, fresh water. However, all the fresh water came from the centermost part of the tribe. It was a huge tent. It was 5 times larger than the other Jack Allen tents, which made it look like conventional houses instead. The tent was erected using various wooden materials. It gave off a kind of feral grace. "Is that the tent of the Jack Allen tribe's chieftain?" Kant slightly narrowed his eyes toward the tent. He was able to easily see the largest tent set up in the center. He grew even more suspicious of what was happening. He saw a withered and wrinkled Jack Allen walk out of the tent with a wooden staff. Even though Kant was on a dune hundreds of feet away from the center of the Jack Allen tribe, he still felt somewhat intimidated. "That old Jack Allen looks dangerous." The desert bandits shared the same thought. One of them couldn't help but say, "He strikes fear into people." "Yet." Kant nodded and frowned. "Just keep quiet and they won't detect us." That old Jack Allen, who was outside the huge tent in the center, seemed to have said something. It caused the Jack Allens throughout the tribe to begin gathering. They formed a rather crooked line. Some of the Jack Allens even began to fight and tear at each other due to their brutal nature. However, a Jack Allen, who looked even stronger, emerged from the huge tent. "It's the Jack Allen chieftain." Kant had read famous works by scholars before, so he immediately recalled who that strong Jack Allen likely was. That strong Jack Allen wore a set of ill-fitted mail armor. It seemed to be something he took from humans. Somehow, he barely managed to wear it on the upper half of his body. On his lower body, he seemed to be wearing something pieced together from 2 sets of mail armor. There was also the outer layer of a linen robe. It covered the mail armor worn beneath. All that made the chieftain look powerful and intimidating. He also held something that differed from what the other Jack Allens were using. It was a 2-handed battle axe. During the dukedom of Leo's purge of the Jack-Allans 10 years ago, they destroyed several larger, stronger Jack-Allan tribes. Their chieftains mostly appeared in such attire. Kant had a bit of an impression of them. As he recalled the books he had read, his mind jolted for a bit. He recalled an article he once read. That old Jack-Allan is that Jack-Allan shaman capable of spell casting. Kant's eyes slightly widened. The old Jack-Allan, who held a wooden staff and stood right outside the huge tent, was a match to what he had read about. He could not have mistaken it for anything else. The mention of such a creature was too fresh in his mind. Furthermore, only Jack-Allan shamans were capable of witchcraft. Also, only a being like that was deemed eligible to share a tent with a Jack-Allan chieftain. That is getting worse. Kant slowly gritted his teeth and flashed a bitter smile. While there were few spellcasters in the world, none of them were to be taken lightly. For instance, the scholars at the Dukedom of Leo recorder information about them. They wrote down that the Jack-Allan shamans should be a top priority target during attacks, and make sure to take them out in the shortest period of time possible. That was because the Jack-Allan shamans were capable of casting spells on their own. Their spells included bloodlust, which could cause their targets to forget pain and know only slaughter. There was also berserk, which was a spell capable of causing a target to become irritable and filled with killing intent. The shaman was also even able to cast stone eskin, which allowed the skin of the target to turn as hard as a rock. All of those were highly regarded spells a capable Jack-Allan shaman could cast. During the purge orchestrated by the dukedom 10 years ago, every time a Jack-Allan shaman was found in a tribe, casualties occurred among the dukedom's forces before they were able to take that tribe down. Casualties included infantry and cavalry units, archers, and even regular armies who tagged alongside mages. If Kant's forces were to take on one such tribe, even if the number of the Jack-Allans was more or less the same as his forces, one Jack-Allan shaman alone was able to tip the scales significantly to the Jack-Allan's favor. That was the edge provided by a spellcaster. They are bringing their water out. The desert bandits gasped, interrupting Kant's thoughts. Kant frowned and looked. A Jack-Allan held a tattered urn in front of the tent. It gulped down fresh water before handing the urn to the next Jack-Allan and going elsewhere. It was the same with the next Jack-Allan. The process was repeated over and over. The entire tribe had all drunk water in order. There's a well in the huge tent. The desert bandits looked at each other. They found affirmation in each other's eyes. Kant nodded as well. He frowned and said, "There is a well. I never expected that their tribe would have found a patch of desert with a well in it. It's no surprise that they were able to get so developed. If there's a well, there should be a huge water reserve underground." The desert bandits were puzzled. But where are the few plants that should be around the place? In truth, there were no plants around the place. Kant frowned. He found himself unable to explain the phenomenon. Kant exhaled and ordered the desert bandits behind him, "We ride home now." Their scouting mission was complete. However, the result was something they found difficult to stomach. In the beginning, Kant thought the Jack-Allan tribe they found next would be of little difference with the one at the Oasis lookout. However, looking at the tribe, which had at least 2,500 of Jack-Allans in it, he became rather dejected. That was not a number he had any way of resisting. "We need to work this one out." Kant gritted his teeth, trying to console himself. At the very least, he had time to rethink his plans. If resisting that many Jack-Allans were to prove impossible, they could immediately give up the Oasis lookout and retreat to the Swadia range. That was possible because Kant still had 65 Swadian infantry units with him. There were more than enough to handle the complex mountainous terrain. Then again, Kant felt reluctant to leave the vast desert behind. This was the place he planned on developing with everything he had. "My lord, maybe we could continue moving deeper into the desert." One of the desert bandits wasn't shy about making a suggestion. Kant looked at the deeper reaches of the Naran desert with a solemn expression. "It seems like there is something deep in the desert." Look at the tracks left behind by the jackallans in the sand. They probably lead somewhere into the deeper parts. Chapter 22, Enemy in the Dark of Night. The evening sun struggled to stay around. It created enough light for them to see what was ahead of them. Kant frowned slightly. His heart raced along with his emotions. This is interesting. As he spoke, Kant's eyes looked rather cold. There was an obvious curved line left on the flat sands north of the messy Jack-Allen tribe. It winded about as it led to a dune. It extended to deeper parts of the desert. The line was clear for all to see. The line itself was darker than its surrounding colors, making it obvious that prolonged travel through the same route caused the sands to harden. The Jack-Allans made these with their steps. As he commented, the desert bandit frowned like Kant. The Jack-Allans, who were still at a primitive tribal state, had no concepts of roads. However, they had still been able to blaze a trail in the desert. It was obvious that they had reasons to do so. They had gone to and fro on the route throughout long periods of time, making the winding path into the most primitive of roads there were. Why are they heading north? Kant was puzzled. The desert bandits pondered that for a bit. One of them looked up and said with a serious expression, "Perhaps that is their daily quest." A daily quest? Kant frowned. The term sounded like something assigned by the system. It is like going out hunting every day. The look on the desert bandit's face turned increasingly serious as he said, "I think it probably leads to the salt mine that we are looking for, which has been taken over by the Jack-Allans. Coarse salt is being excavated every day." "That is speculation." Kant frowned and said, "It sounds rather ridiculous. Jack-Allans were primitive tribal beings. Digging in a salt mine was not something that would have done them any good. Salt was a type of seasoning. At the same time, it was a commodity. Furthermore, it was considered a luxury in the dukedom." Kant did not agree with that desert bandit. To him, even if the Jack-Allans were to actually dig up coarse salts in the salt mine, no merchant had been purchasing the salt, even though the dukedom was so near them. The fact that there was salt in the Naran desert was unheard of back in the dukedom. Things would have been different if the nobles of the dukedom knew that there was a salt mine there. They would have given everything they had to amass a truly elite force and kill every Jack-Allan found in the desert. Kant knew well of their greed. As such, Kant frowned and shook his head in disbelief at that desert bandit. He said, "There can't be any of those brutal primitive Jack-Allans capable of digging out huge amounts of coarse salt and selling them as goods. Can there?" Everyone knew how ferocious Jack-Allans were. They were devoid of any capacity for reasoning and behaved more like beasts. That speculation sounded like little more than a joke to Kant. "My lord, it is still very possible." The desert bandit's expression did not change. His expression remained serious. That severe expression made Kant frown even harder. There was no way troop classes from the system could betray him. Kant took a deep breath and asked, "What are the reasons?" The desert bandit immediately replied, "It's simple, my lord. Look over there at the urn the Jack-Allans drink from. If anything, you should be familiar with that urn." "Yet." Kant narrowed his eyes and peered. He slightly nodded. Even though it was quite a distance away, he was still able to tell apart the urn used by the Jack-Allans for drinking. The black exterior looked severely worn. It was as if it had been left in the desert for a very long time. The mouth of the urn looked broken. It made it so that it was little more than trash to the dukedom of Leo, which produced massive amounts of clay. Not even commoners would have bothered picking such a thing up. If you look closely at the urn, you'll find that they are many in the tribe. The desert bandit's tone grew increasingly serious as he said, "There are always a lot of urns around the messy tents. I don't think the Jack-Allans are using the urns to carry water or anything else." Kant's eyes remained fixed. He stayed silent. He stared at the large Jack-Allan tribe and found himself getting restless. "So, is this true?" Kant slowly asked. It was as if he was asking about the truthfulness of the case, despite knowing deep down that what the desert bandit said was true. It is. The desert bandit nodded. He told Kant, the Jack Allens at the Oasis lookout are related to this place somehow. His tone was confident. Well. Kant's face looked rather bitter. He nodded and said, "It does look like that." He was able to tell from the ambush that night. Those Jack Allens were reinforcements gathered from that huge tribe. If the two tribes were unrelated, they would not have been Jack Allens from that huge tribe forming an army heading for the Oasis lookout to begin with. Kant slightly closed his eyes. He began to lower his head and think. Thoughts sped in his mind at very high speeds. Things looked increasingly worse for him. In his perspective, things had just taken a turn for the worse. It was serious enough that development of the Oasis lookout and establishing a true Trondheim became rather uncertain. His mind was shaken. This was a well-developed Jack Allen tribe. A salt mine had been taken over by a huge Jack Allen tribe. All of that made Kant lose his way. He was puzzled as to what to do next. All he had was a small village with a population of little more than 60. There was no way they could resist the Jack Allen tribe. Trying to do so was like having a death wish. Well, what should we do now? Kant opened his eyes and bitterly smirked. The desert bandits were all silent. They had no answer to that question posed by Kant, their lord. Their forces were simply too small. Kant nodded slightly. He looked grim as he said, "We should take this seriously. If we don't want to die horrible deaths in the Naran desert, we need to absolutely prepare for this." He had not come to the Naran desert to die. Kant clenched his fists a little and reasserted himself. "Let's go. We'll circle around and have a look over there." Kant turned around and told the desert bandits, "I at least want to know if that place holds a true salt mine." Understood. The desert bandits nodded. While the Jack Allen population was massive, that ambush in the night did not kill Kant's forces right where they stood. More than 100 bodies were left behind as they left the Oasis lookout battered and bruised. They had even left enough tracks for his cavalry units to trace them. As he thought deeper, Kant was able to come to a realization. The Jack Allens were not all that powerful in terms of combat capacity. While they were ferocious and of hardier constitutions than normal humans, they lacked excellent strategies and tactics, as well as effective weapons for killing enemies. They also lacked armor capable of protecting their bodies. Swadian peasants, who were all zero-level troop classes, were good enough to take them on. A band of first and second-level troop classes would have been able to practically slaughter Jack Allens of the same number. There was no reason for Kant to be afraid. "Let's go." He gently kicked the stomach of his horse and rode swiftly across the dune. The 6 desert bandits flicked their reins and followed right behind their lord, riding just as swiftly. "I'll finish the system quest and get myself troop classes up to higher levels." Kant reaffirmed his resolve deep down. He was certain that if he were to have 100 fully armed Swadian knights, which were known to be the king of troop classes on land from the system, he would be able to ride straight into such a huge Jack Allen tribe. Despite the odds, he was sure that they would come out on top. They followed the trail left by the Jack Allens on the sand. They moved quickly. The light of the evening was finally gone. A bright moon and dazzling stars were seen in the sky. The temperature throughout the arid air began to drop sharply, making Kant and the desert bandits, who were riding forward on their horses, feel a chill. They put on the woolen clothing they had brought with them and continued riding forward. At times, beginning a journey in the night was the right thing to do, compared to the unforgiving heat of the day and the resulting massive consumption of water. One only needed to keep warm during the night. Kant and the others had only decided to continue riding in the night due to such reasons in the first place. Time gradually passed. The moon was high in the sky. The bright, round celestial entity glowed with an alluring silver radiance. It grew increasingly cold in the night. It made Kant's face felt rather stiff. "Everyone!" He opened his mouth and breathed warm air, yet he pulled back the reins of his steed. He raised his right arm at the same time and said, "Stop riding." The 6 desert bandits behind him immediately got off their desert horses. "My lord, what is happening?" Mist was coming out of their mouths. The heat from their bodies formed a stark contrast with the surrounding temperature. However, they quickly discovered why Kant told them to stop riding. They extended their stiff arms one after another. They reached for the spears they had strapped onto their backs. All of them looked serious. The enemy was coming. Chapter 23, Death Sentence by Exposure to the Sun. There were enemies. The 6 desert bandits were all prepared. They held their standard spears in their hands. At the end of the sandy route before them, where moonlight waned, 7 to 8 shadows were standing at the dune by the side of the route. They were not moving. It was as if the enemy was staring down at them. "Get ready for combat." Kant's voice was heard. He reached for the light crossbow behind his back. He pulled the string and loaded a bolt onto it. He lifted his arm. He aimed at the shadow far away with his finger resting on the trigger. The desert bandits unraveled the sacks on their backs, exposing the pilum just behind their necks. The desert bandits were more versed at throwing those projectiles while riding horses. All of them were ready to fight. "Be careful," Kant reminded them as he rode slowly forward. They were still at a safe distance, which was why they dared to continue closing in. That was an action backed by the fact that they were cavalry units. If they found the enemy's fighting capacity was beyond what they were capable of resisting, they would immediately retreat. Cavalry units were known for their superb mobility. They were able to come and go like a gust of wind. Despite being vigilant, the shadows on the dune paid no heed to them. It was as if they were simply standing on the dune watching Kant and his people without bothering to move away. No movements were detected from the enemy, and no sounds were made by them either. "My lord, something isn't right," a desert bandit said. They eyed the dune. The desert bandits, who were all experts at fighting in the desert, did not let the cold freeze their brains over. Their thought processes remained astute. They looked at the shadows above and instinctively found something was off. "Let's go and have a closer look." Kant nodded. He noticed something was off as well. In a low voice, he still told his men, "If anything happens, retreat immediately." "Understood," the desert bandits replied. They slowly moved forward along the desert route. They gradually closed in. Kant frowned as he continued to eye the shadows far away. His eyes did not fool him. While his sight was somewhat blurred by the dark of night, Kant was able to tell that those shadows were from jackallans. They had beast-like heads and bodies covered in fur. Those were notable physical traits of jackallans. There was no way that Kant, someone who fought them over and over, was mistaken. However, his frown instantly deepened. "Why do those jackallans on the dune look so weird?" he asked. "Indeed." The desert bandits nodded at the same time, looking serious as they did so. In their minds, the jackallans they were closing in on looked very unnatural. They looked shriveled, and their heads were hanging low. It was as if they were tied to something. The bright moonlight above made the dune look even clearer. Kant's pupils slightly contracted. "What the?" he unconsciously mumbled, feeling his emotions fluctuate like he was riding a roller coaster. "My lord, be careful." The desert bandits behind him kicked their horses. All 6 of them moved quickly forward, tightly holding their spears. Their eyes swept vigilantly around them. There was nothing out of place to be found. There were no enemies. All of them breathed a sigh of relief. They refocused their eyes onto the dune. All of them looked shocked. There were indeed 7 jackallans at the top of the dune. They all sported tusks on their lower jaws and were coated in grey fur all over their bodies. They all had jackal-like heads and human-like bodies. However, all of the jackallans were tied to wooden posts. The jackallans were securely tied up with thick ropes from their thighs to their torsos. "What is happening?" Kant still tightly held his light crossbow, but he slightly kicked the belly of his horse instead. The warhorse he rode was perceptive enough to sense the magnitude of force being applied. It slowed down even more. The desert bandits behind him all looked on with grim expressions. Their gazes were fixed on the 7 Jack Allans. One of them said, "All of them are dried corpses. Judging by the temperature of the Naran desert, they have been tied to the posts for at least a week." A week? Kant narrowed his eyes on the bodies. Was it some kind of punishment? "I believe it was an execution," a desert bandit replied. "If that was not an execution, these Jack Allans would not have ended up turning into dried corpses. Their death sentence was carried out by tying them to wooden posts and mercilessly exposing them to the scorching sun of the Naran desert. The Jack Allans slowly dried up while they were alive. It was one of the cruelest punishments that could have been given. Why were they executed in the first place?" Kant frowned even harder. However, he did not fear anything. He vigilantly scanned the dune before him before telling the desert bandits, "Stay sharp. We'll go out and have a look." They were all cavalry units, so there was nothing to be afraid of. Besides, the legs of Jack Allans were no match for the horses. Furthermore, Kant did not believe that the Jack Allans would have found all 7 of them. It was even more ridiculous to think that they had been trying to ambush them by setting up such an obvious trap. If that truly turned out to be the case, the Jack Allans would have simply attacked the Oasis lookout instead. Compared to mobile cavalry units, a village that was unable to go anywhere was a larger, more obvious, and lucrative target. "Hi-ya!" Kant flicked the reins. His feet tightly cradled the horse beneath him. He aimed his light crossbow ahead. When they arrived at the top of the dune, there was no enemy to be found. Kant looked at the dried Jack Allan bodies. With their fangs bared, they still looked ferocious. He frowned and said, "They really died horrible deaths." A desert bandit nodded and said, "Being dried up alive without drinking a single drop of water is brutal." Such penalties had been doled out by desert people and races before. The Saran Sultanate had once employed such penalties, but it was only to deal with ferocious, unforgiving enemies or to sentence criminals who had committed horrendous unforgivable crimes. This is a pity. Kant moved his eyes elsewhere. The dried corpses served to shock and scare enemies. They died horrible deaths, but they were still used after they were dead. However, he hardly felt sorry for them since they were all Jack Allans, which were his enemies. If possible, he would have been willing to sentence all of them to die by sun exposure. That would have dealt with a serious problem early on. That is. Kant turned his eyes around and looked at the place. When he looked at the northern horizon of the dune, his pupils dilated considerably. "Alkali soil!" Kant shouted in surprise. Under the bright moonlight to the north of the dune, a sea of white was seen spreading all over the place. It was as if the sea of white were about to swallow the entire desert. That was the very alkali soil that Kant and his men were looking for. It also verified the desert bandits' speculation that there was indeed a naturally exposed salt mine somewhere in the desert. "This is real." Kant gulped while tightly holding onto his light crossbow. From the perspective of contemporary humans back on Earth, that place was but a useless piece of alkali soil. All the salt found on the ground was poor quality and coarse salt. It was so bad that it only served industrial purposes. It would have never made it into the lives of common people. During the Middle Ages, all that salt was considered a luxury. There was an underground salt mine in Poland from his previous life that served as the main source of edible salt. It supplied the needs of Europe for hundreds of years. The salt mine also contributed to about 30% of tax revenue for Poland every year. That alone spoke volumes of how profitable the salt trade had been. "My lord, those tents over there." A desert bandit directed Kant's attention elsewhere. They had found something out of the ordinary. They saw 40 to 50 ragged tents erected at the edge of the salt mine. From the looks of it, it was the Jack Allans again. Chapter 24, Returning to the Oasis Lookout. The bright moonlight shone on the alkali soil. The snow-white colors looked mesmerizing. It was a special area. It resulted from a lake being surrounded by a desert and exposed to the scorching sun. The surrounding heat accelerated the drying lake's evaporation until only huge amounts of salt were left behind. It does look pretty. Kant softly sighed but remained firmly holding the light crossbow in his hand. He saw 46 ragged tents erected at the edge of the alkali soil. Looking at the messed up appearance and the ground around them filled with dirt and filth severely impacted his mood. More importantly, the beautiful piece of alkali soil that represented wealth and power was already taken. The alkali soil's current master was the Jack Allens. They were the greatest enemy of Trondheim. Things sure look bad. A desert bandit by Kant's side frowned. With a serious expression, he turned around and said to Kant, according to the sizes of the tents, there should be at least 300 or so Jack Allens over there. If what we speculated before turns out to be correct, then those Jack Allens are definitely connected with those from the large tribe. They were probably sent to excavate the salt mine. It does seem like that. Kant nodded. The large-scale Jack Allen tribe had gained full control of the exposed salt mine. Judging from the trail, which had been trampled on so often that the sand had become solid, it was easy to tell that the salt there had been excavated for quite a long time. In truth, excavation was the wrong term to use. The Jack Allens simply collected the salt. The salt mine was exposed in the desert, so anyone would have been able to collect the raw coarse salt all over the place. If he so fancied, Kant, who possessed the techniques to refine them, at any time could have simply refined them into fine white salt that would only grace the tables of nobles in the dukedom of Leo. The salt would have fetched a price of astronomical proportions. At that moment, a prompt from the system appeared. Ding, your arduous journey seemed to have yielded something. Side quest, the origins of salt is complete. Reward acquired, standard Swadian house x5. Comment, the desert that seemed barren contained ample resources, including the exposed salt mine before you. The prompt from the system rang in his ears. The dialog box signaling the completion of the quest appeared on his retina as well. However, there was not a hint of elation or pride found on Kant's face. He knew well enough about the deeper reaches of the desert by then. He had in-depth knowledge of the predicament he currently faced. It was simply too brutal. His heart felt rather heavy. Well, at least it's still an improvement. Kant saw the images of the houses in his retina and shook his head. At the moment, the improvement was not good enough. He flicked his reins and had his horse descend onto the dune. He turned around to face the 6 desert bandits and said, "Let's go. It's time to head home." The quest from the system was completed. He accomplished the goal he had set out to complete. There was currently no need for Kant to take risks and venture into deeper parts of the Naran desert for investigation. Now, he needed to return to the Oasis lookout and developing his Trondheim village to sufficient levels. He had to amass a force capable of resisting the threat of the Jack Allens. All 7 of them swiftly rode toward home. Their path home was far more apparent when compared to the route they had taken when they began their journey. They had gained familiarity with the region. As such, they were able to ride faster and steadier. After midnight, Kant and the 6 desert bandits found a dune to rest at. They dug holes in the sand to stay warm. They lit a campfire and took a rest for the night to conserve their strength. After gaining considerable strength from the break, they continued their journey home the next morning. The trail markings from when they came remained obvious. They were in a desert. Barring sandstorms and strong winds, the tracks left on the sand would take months to flatten and disappear naturally. "My lord, the Jack Allen tribe is ahead. Watch out." The desert bandit who rode at the very front reduced his speed. He turned around and said, "We should take a detour." "Okay, we shall take a detour." Kant nodded. Their current path would have led to that large-scale Jack Allen tribe. It was morning, so they could not just appear right before the Jack Allens without any precautions. They had to avoid alerting the Jack Allens and exposing themselves. As such, they circled the tribe. They avoided alerting the Jack-Allans by circling their tribe before continuing to ride toward the Oasis lookout. They gained speed by tracing the tracks left behind when they left the Oasis lookout. Besides, following their own tracks when they came was the safest thing to do. After they took a break at noon, the Oasis lookout finally appeared before their eyes around the evening. "My lord, it's the council hall." The desert bandit at the forefront looked somewhat tired before. When he saw the council hall and their lair, he sighed a breath of relief. He turned around and looked at Kant with a relieved expression, saying, "We're finally home." "Yes, we are." Kant slowly nodded. He was seemingly exhausted. Traveling for prolonged periods, even when riding a horse, made them feel as if their bodies had hit their limits. As for the warhorse and the desert horses, they jogged with their heads hung low. They had no more strength to run. The horses needed rest as much as the men who had ridden them. The horses had played an absolutely key role in getting their scouting mission done. When Kant and the desert bandits kept riding forward, the Swadian troops, who were tasked with guard duty at the Oasis lookout, quickly discovered them approaching. 5 Swadian militia, who carried hunting crossbows, stood on a dune. They were on high alert. When they detected Kant and the desert bandits, they quickly walked over and paid their respects. "My lord." "Yet." Kant nodded as he flipped his hood over. He asked, "How have the past 2 days been?" "Everything was normal, my lord." The Swadian militia answered respectfully. During the day or so that Kant was out on his mission, the Oasis lookout was not met with another attack from the Jack-Allans. Everything looked rather peaceful and calm. However, all of that was simply like underwater currents beneath the surface of the ocean, so he had arranged for the militia to stand guard. It was preferable to think that desert sand could be used as flour than simply believing that the Jack-Allans would not attack. Kant ordered, "Stay sharp." He led his horse and continued moving into the Oasis. He wore a sleepy smile on his face. Both the council hall and the desert bandit lair were built at the southern side of the pond. About a third of the watchtower had been finished. Many Swadian troops trained at their own volition with their weapons in their hands. It seemed as if the village's defenses were being set on the right path. The warhorse that he rode had even picked up the pace. The horses evidently knew that they were home and finally able to rest. "My lord, welcome home." "Oh, revered Lord Kant, it's a pleasure to see you." When Kant returned to the council hall, all of the Swadian recruits and Swadian militia greeted him respectfully. To them, Kant was everything. "Very well," Kant replied. However, he was very exhausted. He immediately got off his horse. He wanted to go to his room and finally get some good rest. "Feed the horses and give them a wash." Kant looked at the recruits taking the horses and said, "When you're done with all of that, let the horses rest in the stable of the lair." "Will do, my lord." The recruits nodded. They led Kant's warhorse and the desert bandits' desert horses away. The grass was prepared in the manger. Bits of dried meat and dates were added to the feed. They were the best things available for the horses to regain their strength after the long journey. After they were done eating, the horses were given a good wash. Handing all of that to the recruits enabled Kant to relax. He was so tired that he felt as if he was no longer able to keep his eyes open. He quickly went to his room on the second floor. He needed a good rest. None of them had slept well the previous night, and they had been riding home the whole day afterward. They were thoroughly exhausted by the journey. The exhaustion was more than what they were able to take. The 6 desert bandits quickly returned to their lair. Once they all fell onto their beds, they started loudly snoring. Chapter 25, Refugees of Swadia. After riding long hours day and night, Kant was dead tired when he returned to the Oasis lookout. He needed some good sleep. He was not able to truly think about what to do next without regaining his mental and physical strength. His next decisions included constructing the 5 Swadian standard houses rewarded by the system. It was something that involved city planning, which meant he needed to carefully consider the matter. The Oasis lookout was not a large oasis with huge tracts of land. He speculated that the area of the entire oasis was actually puny. It was likely less than 1,000 square feet. There was also a pond with fresh spring water that measured approximately 82 x 20 feet. The Swadian houses, which were to be constructed from stone and wooden materials, need at least 1,600 square feet each. If he were to build all 5 buildings without proper planning, it meant that he could easily fill the entire southern side of the Oasis lookout with them. There was no way Kant wanted that to happen. It was imperative that he properly planned the layout of the buildings. Kant did not sleep for long. He slowly opened his eyes. Kant looked at the window. He saw bright sunlight shining through. He rubbed his face and freshened himself up. He put on his clothes and went downstairs. Several Swadian recruits emerged from the storage room. When they saw him descending the stairs, all of them bowed respectfully to him. "Good day, my lord." "Right, good day." Kant nodded. He glanced at the cabbage and dried meat in their hands. It looked as if they were getting food prepared. The words from one of them proved his deduction. "My lord, it will soon be noon, so we're preparing lunch." "It's noon already, eh?" Kant rubbed his eyebrow and waved at the hard-working and humble recruits. "Carry on." The recruits nodded respectfully and replied, "Yes, my lord." They headed to the kitchen with the lunch ingredients in their hands. Social castes were clearly divided in the kingdom of Swadia. The scorching sun hit Kant as soon as he walked out of the council hall. The entire place was steeped in unbearable, scorching heat. "My lord." The Swadian militia guarding the door bowed respectfully as he addressed Kant. The builders, who were all wearing long robes and hoods, were carefully transporting construction materials. They even placed handkerchiefs on top of the surfaces they were hitting with a hammer. They were afraid of disturbing the quiet and peaceful council hall next to the construction site. Kant turned around and looked at their progress. The shape of the watchtower was now taking shape. Piled stone formed the base and platform. Strong wooden materials were used to build the tower's walls and ladders. While the watchtower was nowhere near being finished, the silhouette was still visible. The construction workers estimated that the tower would be finished within 7 days. There seemed to be no problems in meeting that deadline. "You're back, my lord." The building foreman of the builders quickly came over to Kant. His honest-looking face was adorned with a beaming smile. "Yet." Kant simply nodded at the seemingly honest yet actually cunning face of the foreman. He looked very much like a Swadian merchant. He plainly said, "Keep the pace as it is. It's best if you guys can finish by the deadline. It is imperative that you do so." "Rest assured, my lord. It will definitely be finished as planned." The foreman flashed a beaming smile. Kant nodded. "That is good to hear. I'll head over to hurry them up." The foreman was able to tell that Kant could easily see through him. He wanted to suck up to the lord of the land but had failed. He still feared Lord Kant. He quickly scurried away after saying a few words. He didn't dare stay around Kant any longer. What a sly merchant! Kant shook his head lightly as he looked at the back of that foreman. It seemed that all characters materialized by the system had their own personalities and will instead of deadpan-looking NPC programs. However, it was due to those personalities that emotions and behaviors, such as flattery, comparing oneself to others of a higher status, jealousy, and even bullying the weak yet fearing the strong, as well as being brutal and ill-disposed, were included. While none of those had fully been shown in front of Kant, the roots of such things were still clearly there. He wondered if that was a good or bad thing. Then again, as long as they remained loyal to Kant, he had no intention of interfering too much. At the moment, the most important thing was to have all 5 Swadian standard houses constructed. Kant walked around the southern side of the pond. He had not walked for long before turning around. "This place is too small." He frowned slightly and quietly sighed. The Oasis lookout was too small. It was so small that even his current plan required extreme caution. He needed to consider the future. He thought for a short while. Kant's eyes focused on the sand beyond the oasis. A thought came to mind. He connected to the system in his mind, asking in silence, "System, could I construct my buildings on the sand?" He had no doubt made an empiricist error. Due to help from the system, Kant's buildings would have been just as sturdy even if he built them on the sand. The system replied quickly, "It is permissible." Kant smiled. It was something could be done after all. Kant walked a straight line toward the south for 32 feet. He passed the council hall, watchtower, and the desert bandit lair. By the time he stopped walking, it was only sand beneath his feet. "All right." Kant subtly nodded. "This should be the spot." As he confirmed it with the system, the 5 standard Swadian houses immediately materialized into the world. Huge streams of data began to coil and wrap around each other. It took mere seconds for the buildings to fully materialize. The foundations and walls, which were about 11 inches thick, were constructed neatly using stone. It gave them a sense of sturdiness and heft. The buildings also looked safe. The top of each building was slanted. The roofs were constructed using uniformly dried wooden materials to prevent overflow from rainwater. A layer of tiles was piled on top of the roof. Then again, they were in the desert, so there was no need to worry about rain. There was no rain to be found in the desert. It was not something he needed to worry about. The 5 houses were lined against one another, forming a straight row. The houses were situated in the south and faced north. The doors opened toward the pond, which was located across from the council hall and desert bandit lair. The 32 feet that Kant had walked became the street. There were no cracks between the houses. The walls were built against one another, making it seem as if all 5 of them were a single building. If a ladder were placed against the wall leading to the roof, one could have easily walked through all 5 houses. It was constructed in that manner for safety reasons. Kant had thought it all out. If a massive amount of enemies approached, the forces garrisoning the buildings were now easily able to make it outside to the 32-foot street. It enabled them to use the buildings on both sides to form formations and securely guard the street. His forces had the ability to block off both ends of the street. A small force of Swadian infantry units, armed with pole arms, was enough to defend the place steadily and efficiently. As for the others, they had the option to stand on top of the roofs and use the 9-foot-tall wall to serve as vantage points. That enabled them to accurately aim and shoot at enemies coming in from both sides and support the comrades painstakingly blocking off both ends of the street. Even if the enemy was able to get up to the roofs to fight them up close and personal, the Swadian forces had the terrain advantage, which further enabled their ability to easily repel the enemy. The layout formed the early structure of a fortress. In truth, that was how Kant thought things out. The threat posed by the Jack-Allans was huge and nearby. It was possible for them to easily overwhelm the Oasis lookout. Peaceful development was a luxury that Trondheim was unable to afford. Kant needed to build his village like a fortress, but he also needed to do more. The ultimate goal he had for Trondheim was for it to attain the castles available in the system. They were tall, sturdy constructs capable of making one side of the place utterly impregnable. They were at the southernmost part of the Naran Desert, which was the location of the only oasis with a water source. It was to become a main transport hub. Be it to venture deep into the Naran Desert from the Sinway Range or to cross into the range from the desert and enter human civilization, that small oasis was destined to become a place travelers had to pass through. Kant's Trondheim was expected to serve as the heart of the desert. At present, Kant also had to deal with the most direct threat to his place, the Jack-Allans. With those simple defenses put in place, it enabled him to rely only on 30 Swadian recruits and 35 Swadian militia to resist a nightly ambush from over 500 Jack-Allans. As long as the Jack-Allans did not bring anything out of the ordinary, they would have the capacity to resist those attacks. I'll at least have the capacity to defend myself. Kant nodded to himself. While the threat from the Jack Allen tribe was still out there, Kant's development was carried out quickly. Things were changing. At that moment, a dialog box instantly appeared on Kant's retina. Ding! Refugees of Swadia incident triggered. A group of Swadians, who were robbed of their homes due to war, are coming. They see the empty houses in your village. It makes these people, who have suffered from drifting about, see hope. They request to join your village. Swadians X50. Do you accept? Chapter 26, New System Functions. Hey! Kant was slightly startled. Refugees. He felt rather puzzled. However, he was quickly reminded of the introduction of the houses. Thus, he immediately realized what had happened. House, civilian building of stone and wooden materials. Increases population and attracts an influx of citizens when the population in the village is low. Requires 100 dinars and 7 days for construction. That explained the attributes of the building. All 5 empty houses served to attract refugees, which was why the incident happened. It was indeed a boon for Trondheim. Accept. Kant's tone was affirmative. He had no hesitation whatsoever. You have mercifully decided to accept the Swadians who have nowhere to go. Acquired, Swadian peasants X50. A prompt was heard from the system. Another dialog box popped up before Kant knew what had happened. The Swadians are spreading the word of your deeds. Reputation, plus 100 honor, plus 1. Reputation system activated. Honor system activated. Current reputation, 10 current honor, 1. Reputation can be used to accelerate construction. Honor can be used to draw packs. Kant looked rather dumbfounded. He was puzzled about what he had just read. Did accepting those Swadian refugees actually open up new system functions? Reputation. Honor. Kant knew those terms well. Both had been important stats in the game in his previous life. They were tied to the player's evaluation and relations. They were also tied to the number of forces the player could command. They were even related to whether the player was able to get married and become a king. Is something different here? Kant realized that in that real world he was in, the system changed how those two stats worked. This was not the continent of Caravan that he knew. He was not in a made-up game world. There was also no specific data regarding much of anything, so the data did not limit the number of troops he was able to command. As such, there was no need for evaluations and relations. There was also no need to enhance the number of forces he was able to command. He would not have had to mingle with noble ladies or become king of a certain nation. System, explain how those two stats work. Instead of speculating, Kant chose to ask. Besides, the system was able to explain everything. Reputation, acquired through winning battles and improving civilian life. Specific reputation stats are dependent on the host. Specifically, 100 reputations could be spent on hastening construction by 1 day. Now, Kant was even more baffled. He frowned and muttered, "Can things could actually work that way?" Back in the game he played in his previous life, lacking advanced engineering attributes meant requiring constructions to take tens of days to complete. That rate of construction was utterly frustrating. A high-tempo game was rather intolerant of such a sluggish rate of construction. Even after coming to this world, Kant still had something to complain about regarding the rate of construction. While he knew the rate was several times higher than it would have actually been, no one wanted to wait for so many days. Most people liked to have things done swiftly. However, what truly caught Kant's attention was the system's honor function. The system showed a dialog box to provide further elaboration regarding it. Honor, acquired through the acquisition of epic victory and acquisition of legendary evaluation. Specifically, 1 honor could be spent to enter the mall for drawing prizes, acquiring mysterious packs. Remark, mysterious packs are divided into troop class pack, military equipment pack, item pack, construction pack, and hero pack. Please explore on your own for further details. Kant's eyes lit up. He seemed to be mulling something deep down. The honor system seemed more powerful than the reputation system. One only needed to look at the system's description of honor to tell that much. Epic victory. Legendary evaluation. Those two terms looked like extraordinarily difficult feats to achieve. At the very least, in all three victories he scored against the Jack Allans since he came to the Naran Desert, the comments regarding his battles had never had terms like epic or legendary in them. It seems rather difficult to acquire honor. Kant shook his head. In truth, even back in the game played in his previous life, acquiring honor was much more difficult than acquiring reputation. However, Kant was unable to help but feel curious about these things. He opened up the reputation system section and found he had acquired one honor. He looked at the prizes available for drawing in the mall, which required him to only spend that one honor to get something. Kant felt very tempted to try it out. Maybe I could give it a try? He thought. He planned to give it a try on the spot. While honor did not come easy, it was still something usable in the mall. It would have made little difference whether he used any honor he had now or later. My lord. While he was still thinking about the mall, he heard a voice. The system page was turned off on his retina. Kant turned around and found a Swadian militia member standing next to him. He frowned and asked the man, "What's the matter?" The Swadian militia reported, "My lord, we have discovered quite a large number of people heading here." "Yeah, that's right." Kant nodded, knowing that the 50 Swadian refugees had arrived. He turned around to look in the direction the Swadian militia member pointed. Many people were seen dragging luggage, both huge and small, on the horizon. They were arduously making their way through the desert, heading for the oasis before their eyes. "Is there anything you need us to do?" the militia member asked. Kant shook his head lightly and said, "No, those people are all poor refugees from Swadia. They're Swadians." The militia was slightly baffled. There were 35 Swadian militia members, who carried hunting crossbows in their hands, around him. All of them gathered around with the intention of getting into formation. After hearing what Kant said, they all slowly put down their weapons. No one wanted to fight their own countrymen. "Yeah, they're all Swadians." Kant nodded and said at the same time, "Get food and water ready. They all look exhausted." "Understood." The Swadian militia members all nodded. Several of them left the group. However, the remaining Swadian militia members did not immediately disperse. They were still all lined up with their hunting crossbows in hand. They all narrowed their gaze on all the refugees, who were getting increasingly closer to the oasis. Although they knew those people were their countrymen, they still saw protecting their lord and the village as their topmost priorities. Despite being of the same nation, Swadians fought among each other time and again. As opposed to their expressions, it went without saying that Kant looked calm. Before too long, all 50 Swadian refugees arrived in front of Kant and the soldiers. They all wore ragged, dirty linen clothing that made them look like beggars. Their faces were filled with grime as if it had been a long time since they last showered. All of them had a stink about them, making anyone else who got near them frown. "Welcome to Trondheim." Kant stepped forward and nodded, saying, "You shall all have food, water, and hope for the future." "Thank you, merciful Lord." All of the refugees stood still. Their gazes were locked on Kant. After hearing Kant welcoming them, they all merrily cheered. Many of them even shed tears. The continent of Caravan was far from being a peaceful place. All 5 nations warred against each other. In the end, it was not the nobles who suffered. The ones who suffered were those commoners at the bottom rung of society. Bandits were everywhere. Acts of plunder from enemy forces posed a severe threat to their lives. "Take them to shower and get them some food." Kant turned around and said to the militia members behind him, "I'll leave you all in charge. When they're done resting, get them some simple menial work to do so they can get used to the place. Everyone has to pull their own weight in this oasis lookout." understood. The Swadian militia members nodded. The soldiers gathered the refugees around and led them to the council hall and newly constructed houses. The food was ready. It was time for the Oasis lookout troops to have lunch. System wall. Kant remained standing where he was. A dialogue box appeared on his retina. A treasure chest-like image was on the dialogue box. Kant instantly realized something. If there was some prize to be drawn, it was probably the chest doing the work. That meant the draw was definitely random. System, activate prize drawing in the mall, Kant quietly muttered to himself. Ding, system mall activated. Due to this being your first time using the system mall, you get an extra chance at drawing X1. A dialogue box from the system appeared on his retina. However, it gave Kant a surprise. An extra chance at drawing? Does that mean I can draw twice? Begin the drawing. Kant had no hesitation in making the decision. The image of the treasure chest on his retina began to slowly open. The treasure chest gradually opened. Mysterious colors were visible. At that moment, Kant heard a prompt. Ding, you have acquired Troop Class Pack. Your troop class attracted a small group of desert bandits to join your forces. Acquired, Desert Bandit X10. A system prompt was heard. Kant was dumbfounded. What a prize! As he gulped, his eyes showed obvious surprise in them. That one draw gave him 10 desert bandits. Recruiting in the lair required at least 7 weeks to complete. That meant recruiting 10 desert bandits to serve him would have taken approximately 2 months. Instead, that feat was easily completed with just one simple draw. Chapter 27, Special Reward from the System. He gained 10 desert bandits without having to do anything, which made him incredibly happy. With the 6 desert bandits resting in the lair added to the fray, as well as the building's trait allowing him to recruit 1 desert bandit every week, he only needed to wait for a month to gather 20 desert bandits. At that time, he would have the ability to build a cavalry platoon. He would have a platoon of cavalry units created with bandits, who were known for their ferocity. All of them were armed with spears and pylons. As such, when the group of desert bandits grew to a certain size, he could use them to shock troops crashing down onto enemy lines. As auxiliary units added to the mix, they could harass enemy formations. For those bandits used to living in the desert, they were all familiar with these tactics. Very nice. Kant smiled. Anticipation was seen in his eyes. His first draw gave him a lofty reward. He wondered what he would come from his second draw. He quietly muttered, "Continue drawing." The system confirmed the command. The dialogue box refreshed on his retina. A new treasure chest appeared. It slowly opened. The rainbow lights gradually turned golden. Ding, you have acquired item pack. You opened the item pack and found Intimidation, banner, dot. Acquired, Intimidation, banner. At the same time, Kant saw a card with a banner-like image appear in the dialogue box on his retina. His pupils slightly contracted. Well, Kant mumbled. He quickly realized something and said, "System, open introductions of the item. Intimidation, banner. Attribute, 1. Reduce enemy morale within a 500-yard radius. 2. Put enemy forces in mass panic when killing enemy leaders. 3. Disperse enemy forces easily due to panic and fear. 4. Boost your forces' morale when the enemy suffers casualties. Introduction: this is a legendary banner. Victory belongs to you with the banner by your side." He was dumbfounded. He was truly dumbfounded. If the first draw surprised him, the second draw nearly terrified him. That was because of the attributes of the item he had drawn. It was capable of reducing enemy morale, which meant tearing down the will of the enemy to fight and making the bravest of warriors into scared recruits. It even allowed him to cause them to suffer mental breakdowns, forcing them to leave the battlefield in fear. There was more to it than that. The banner also enabled the death of enemy forces, which would boost his forces' morale. This is some goddamn sacred tool of the battlefield. The banner's effects meant that even the weakest and most timid of sissies would be affected. It enabled his forces to fight the enemy while roaring at the top of their lungs. Intimidation, et. He gulped. Kant's pupils contracted as he considered what it all meant. He quickly recovered from the dazed state, which had been caused by the shock of learning about such an item being in his possession. The card with the image of the banner was still on his retina. Kant felt his throat become rather parched. By then, he had recognized the origins of that item. It, of course, had a lot to do with the system. Light and darkness. Kant's eyes brightened as he muttered, the name of the mod Intimidation. The Intimidation banner was actually from one of the system's mods, Light and Darkness. It was a title acquired when the player fulfilled some strict and unforgiving requirements. The effects were also similar. However, that intangible title had become a real banner. Its effects were modified to affect the entire battlefield with that specific radius from the flag. Materialize. Kant linked his mind to the system. The data started flowing about. When the data streams dispersed, the banner fell onto his hand. It was the Intimidation banner. Its staff was made from a yew tree, and its thickness felt exactly right. It enabled a grown adult to firmly clinch it. The top of the staff had a banner, which was woven using the finest of linen, hanging from it. It was dyed in crimson colors that resembled blood. A majestic lion was sewn onto the middle of the banner. The banner swayed even when there was no wind, as if to intimidate anyone who was up to no good. So, this is intimidation. Kant felt his mouth become dry. However, his eyes had gotten increasingly bright as he looked on with passion and surprise. It was not just because he had acquired an item that could have been considered sacred. Kant's thoughts went further than that. He had discovered that the system, which had come into the world with him, was not a regular version. It had carried a mod that came with mystical items and powerful troop classes. It was just like the Light and Darkness mod. There was more than just intimidation. There was also commanding power and supreme commander's might. There were also all manners of truly sacred items. Well. Kant held the banner firmly and asked the system, if I acquire ample honor and draw in the system wall, would I be able to summon these sacred items from the mod? The system gave him a short, concise answer. You could. This is great. Kant nodded slowly. His eyes were filled with excitement. He had been in that world for 16 years. He knew that in a world of swords and magic, everything was not what it seemed to be on the surface. Mysterious mages. Ferocious alien races. None were the same as that on Earth from his previous life. Due to the system providing troops that only used cold weapons, from Kant's perspective, he was bound to meet unusual powers that would be difficult to resist. That problem was now solved. The prize drawings had given him sacred items with special attributes. They were on par with those unusual powers. It was just as Kant knew the place to be. The dukedom of Leo worshipped Edmund, the god of war, who bestowed his worshippers with divine spells related to war. However, divine spells like intimidation were only accessible to top-class priests of the warrior faith. At the moment, Kant was able to easily get his hands on items that equaled high-level divine spells in terms of power. I sure look forward to the future. He lowered his head and snickered. Jack Allens? So what? I could get rid of them using zero-level peasants working with a small group of first and second-level low-class troop classes. With Kant coming into possession of intimidation, which worked like a sacred item, he saw no need to fear threats from the primitive race. The power he had come to possess was even more powerful. Kant held onto the banner and headed into the Oasis lookout. The smell of food in the air immediately hit his nose. It was lunchtime in Trondheim. The refugees, who were done showering and neatly dressed in new clothes, gathered to enjoy a simple lunch. All of them had smiles on their faces. They had all become subjects of Kant's fief. They planned to live a good life there as Swadian peasants. The builders also stopped working. They gathered around the watchtower, which was more than half finished, and ate with their heads hung low. All of them enjoyed protection. Swadian recruits and Swadian militia took turns eating and standing guard on both ends of the street and the roofs. At the top of the dunes, on both the northern and eastern sides, militia members were carrying hunting crossbows. They served as guards, vigilantly eyeing the desert before them and guarding their home against possible Jack Allen forces. Many people appeared in the desert bandit lair. Suddenly, 16 fierce-looking desert bandits emerged. All of them were well-armed and looked like manifestations of the term ferocious. They were all true ruffians. "This is my village, Trondheim." Kant smiled. Many stood and bowed to him respectfully. It was a gesture of respect paid to their lord. Kant nodded to all of them one after another. He did not look arrogant. He simply remained quiet and composed. A militia member offered to hold the banner for him. Kant arranged for the intimidation banner to be erected at the door of the council hall. With its ability to extend 500 yards, it was just about enough to cover the entire Oasis lookout. The banner itself was able to be moved at a moment's notice as well. The smell of food had grown increasingly thick. Food that had been prepared specifically for Kant was brought to him. Kant took a deep breath. He looked very contented. "Let's eat." Chapter 28, A New Week. The early morning sun rose on the eastern side of the desert. The temperature gradually rose. Despite not having been freed of the chill of dawn just yet, the morning sun still brought warmth to the place. It was a new day. At the same time, it was also a new week for everyone at the Oasis lookout. Sunlight shone on the wooden window of the council hall. Several birds of unknown names chirped and flapped their wings. They were seemingly happy at the arrival of dawn as well. Everything looked peaceful. "It's morning, et." Kant woke up. He rubbed his face a little, gradually clearing his head of the dazed state of being half asleep. He lifted the woolen blanket. He grabbed the clothes at the top of his bed and put them on. He was no longer able to continue sleeping. The system had given him a prompt. Ding! As the morning sun rises, a new week begins. Income: your Trondheim village collected 50 dinars in taxes. Expenditure: you have paid 360 dinars to your forces as salary. All the sleepiness he had was immediately dispelled. This really is a heavy blow. Kant was dumbfounded. The system closed the account once a week. Kant did not have villages or regular forces before, so he had no taxes to collect or payments of any kind to settle. As such, he had forgotten all about it. He looked at the expenditure column. He frowned at the high amount of 360 dinars. This isn't just paying a lot. It's paying a hell of a lot. Kant looked troubled and gritted his teeth. This is terrible. Then again, there was nothing he could have done about it. According to the size of his current forces, the weekly expenditure was important and hefty. It was so much so that it far exceeded the amount he had spent building the village's buildings. Swadian recruit, 1 dinar per week. Swadian militia, 4 dinars per week. Desert bandit, 12 dinars per week. Those were the weekly individual payouts. With the number of troops thrown in, it had grown to be 30 dinars for 30 Swadian recruits. 140 dinars for 35 Swadian militias. 192 dinars for 16 desert bandits. The total was 360 dinars. The expenditure incurred by the weekly maintenance of his forces gave Kant quite a headache. The numbers looked almost terrifying. System. Kant sighed. Display the remaining amount. Capital, 20 dinars. The system plainly listed the requested data. Kant was unable to do anything but allow a bitter smirk to form. I knew it. A week ago, Kant, who just arrived at the Oasis lookout, had acquired 1,000 dinars as a reward. 7 days had quickly passed. Now, 20 dinars were left in his account. That bit of money left in the game in his previous life would have meant bankruptcy. Worse still, Kant was in a real world. Without dinars, the currency recognized by the system, getting around in the world was nearly impossible. He was not able to maintain his forces, let alone develop the village. At present, he sorely lacked the 360 dinars required to pay his forces for the upcoming week. There was an option to disband his forces. However, that meant digging his own grave. The threat of the jack-allans loomed over him like the sword of Damocles hanging over one's head. If he disbanded his forces, the next time the ferocious primitive race hit, the Oasis lookout would likely end up razed altogether. The end of the line, et. Kant shook his head. He felt a surge of exhaustion overwhelm him. He walked out of his room and went downstairs. He headed outside the council hall. Many peasants were working by the side of the pond. They were digging up sand and mud. "Good morning, my lord." "Good morning, our revered lord." "My lord, good morning." When they saw him, all of them greeted Kant. Kant nodded and said, "Morning." He turned around and looked at the side of the council hall. The 26-foot-tall watchtower was finished. The tower was completed the day before. The builders from Sunno had all left the Oasis lookout through the system. There was little to nitpick about their construction skills. The base was constructed from stone. The main body was constructed with wooden materials nailed together. The roof looked like that of a small house. All aspects of the structure looked as sturdy and reliable as they could have been. It looked finer than the usual workmanship of watchtowers found in common villages. There was one Swadian militia currently standing guard above. Holding his hunting crossbow, he was on high alert. 4 Swadian recruits, who were armed with spears, stood at the base of the watchtower. They served as messengers. They relayed any news received from the tower to every corner of the Oasis. The 26-foot-tall watchtower had a great view. Even if the jack-allans gathered and attacked again, the Swadian militia was prepared. As long as there was ample light in their surroundings, their good view from the watchtower allowed them to detect anything before an attack. It provided them enough time to get their defenses ready and give the jack-allans a run for their money. "My lord, good morning." The desert bandits had returned. They were still on their horses. They currently served as scouts. They patrolled around the Oasis lookout. They had found nothing unusual during their patrol. That was good news. However, the leading desert bandit frowned and looked at Kant before saying, "Please forgive the forthcoming tone, my lord, but I seem to find you looking rather displeased." It was more than just being displeased. Everyone throughout the Oasis noted Kant's upset face. It was all due to problems with capital. Kant nodded slightly and did not bother denying. "Yeah, I'm not quite in the mood." The desert bandits were unable to do anything to solve that. It was such that in that world, solutions for certain problems were few and far between. At the very least, Kant still had no idea of how to use the world's currencies to exchange for the dinars required by the system. Currencies like great silver and gold did not elicit any reaction from the system. Kant experimented back in the dukedom of Leo. He had asked the system if the exchange was possible. The system had given him a short, concise answer. "It is not possible." The acquisition of dinars was only possibly by finishing quests from the system. "Oh well." Kant sighed. "It's like I have system quests to do every day." It seemed as if the system realized what Kant was thinking. A dialog box immediately appeared on his retina. Ding, main quest assigned. Main quest, value of dinar. Reward, grocery store X1. Introduction, dinar is the only currency, but it is not something that cannot be exchanged. Find an area and deposit all of your current dinars. You will acquire the only building that can solve your current predicament. Hey? Can't read the message on the retina and frowned. This is a main quest. It looks rather simple. No. It isn't just simple. It looks almost free. A grocery store? Kant gulped. He was reminded of the game from his previous life. There were 4 types of shops in the markets of cities and towns. A grocery store was one of them. He turned his eyes toward the council hall. To the east, there was the watchtower and desert bandit lair, but there was nothing to the west. System, build the place there. Kant had made a quick decision. Data streams instantly surged. On the western side of the council hall, where he had just had his eyes on, a typical Swadian building of stone and wood appeared within mere seconds. Chapter 29, Trade Caravan from Reyvadin. A new building instantly appeared. It stood right on the western side of the council hall, which was more than 2,142 square feet, and was level with the 5 Swadian houses. It was like 2 parallel lines. Kant had planned this layout of the buildings and streets. When Kant took a good look at the grocery store, he found the place to look rather rough compared to the other meticulously built buildings. The base was constructed from stone while its main body was formed with wood tied with ropes. The window also served as an open counter. It was built with thick wooden planks that supported the window on both sides from the ground up. It also provided shade from the sun. However, there was nothing on the counter. The entire grocery store was empty. Merchants notwithstanding, there was not even a single piece of merchandise found within it. A prompt came from the system. Ding, your new building was finished thanks to your hard work. Main quest, value of dinar completed. Reward, grocery store X1. Introduction, you now own a grocery store capable of exchanging items for dinar. Of course, you are required to possess items of value to the system before you can exchange them for dinar. Kant frowned. He looked around the empty store and saw the introduction on the dialog box. His gaze lingered on the word that was being emphasized. Kant repeated the line, items of value, et. The line looked simple. It looked so simple that it felt impossible to comprehend. However, Kant remained puzzled as to what the items of value meant. Great silver? Precious jewelry? He had tried trading with the system using such items back at the castle in the dukedom of Leo, but to no avail. System, I don't understand. Kant frowned. He needed to ask about anything that puzzled him. As such, he contacted the system in his mind and asked, what do you mean by value in this case? The system was quiet for a bit. A reply came seconds later. Items with mystical powers. Items with mystical powers. Kant frowned even harder. The term sounded rather complex. Indeed. The system swiftly provided an example. Peculiar items with effects like those of intimidation could be used to exchange for dinar. It was Kant's turn to stay silent. He turned around and looked at the intimidation banner erected at the door of the council hall. Even though there was no wind around, it slightly billowed. A golden lion bearing its fangs and claws was sewn on the red background, giving it a shock factor. It was as if the lion were about to eat someone alive. Peculiar items, et. Kant muttered. He now had an idea of what kinds of things the system considered as being of value. He lowered his head for a moment and slowly asked, do you mean magical items? Indeed. The reply from the system was short and concise. Kant's face displayed a bitter smirk. I knew it. In this world, one of swords and magic, there were the likes of the Jack-Allans, dwarves, elves, beastmen, and other races. There were also professions, such as mages, priests, and the likes, which possessed items of mystical powers. Examples of which included magical items. Then again, due to those items being of mystical powers, they were also especially precious. Can't read a lot about them in the books from the scholars, but the only piece that he had truly seen with his own eyes was in the room of his cheapskate father, the Duke of Caravan. It was a set of armor. The armor was comprised of 2 layers of fine mail armor that were covered by a layer of scales on the outside. The palace mages of the dukedom of Leo infused the set of armor with mysterious magical powers. It enabled its defense to be reinforced while its weight was reduced. The magical spells infused also prevented it from rusting, making the set of armor one of the most precious pieces of treasure owned by the line of dukes of the dukedom. It was so precious that Kant, the youngest son of the duke, was deemed unqualified to touch it. That alone spoke volumes of the extreme rarity of such magical items. Buying something like that, from what Kant remembered, was as difficult as reaching heaven. Hell, what's even the point then? He continued wearing that bitter smirk and grumbled at the system. Such items served as anchors and heirlooms of clans. At the very least, Kant had never seen any noble clans selling such items before. Even if those nobles fell into decline, the ones who sold such items had been limited to a very small handful in history. Those magical items still served to lift the fallen clans up again one day. If they were sold, those clans would have been done for through and through. Furthermore, even if there were to be people selling such items, Kant had no money to buy them. System, would you be able to provide some more substantial advice? He continued to smirk as he shook his head. Yes. The system actually answered, which was something unexpected. Kant was stunned. He asked, what would that be? The system did not answer. Instead, a quest was given. Ding special quest assigned. Special quest, explore the mysterious. Reward, 5,000 dinars. Introduction, the Jack Allen tribe deep in the desert seems to have hidden some sort of mystical power. Maybe you should take a look and seek the source of said power. From what he was able to tell from the introduction, the quest seemed simple. It was a scouting quest. However, Kant quickly frowned soon after. Explore the mysterious. He was proficient in deductive reasoning. As such, he was easily able to discover the hidden meaning of the quest. It was not possible that it was anything else. It was definitely a scouting quest. Based on what he was told in the introduction, if he was unable to find out what the source of that mysterious power was, there was no way for him to finish the quest. It was a special quest. The last time he had this type of quest, he was told to look into the military organizations of that world. The reward had been the light crossbow currently on his back. Things will be difficult this time though. He slowly sighed. It was not just difficult. It was extremely difficult. After all, he was tasked to look into the Jack Allen tribe deep in the desert. That tribe was huge. From what he was able to find out so far, it had a population of over 2,500. Look into that place? That is like saying I have a death wish. If those Jack Allens all rushed out from their tribe, they were capable of engulfing the entire Oasis lookout. If he told his forces, which were fewer than 80 strong, to fight an enemy force of 2,500, it was like having them dig their own graves. Sheer numbers alone were more than enough to overwhelm the difference in quality. Besides, the quality of Kant's forces had yet to reach the ability to fight 10 at a time and still come out on top. The special quest does not have a set completion date. The system replied, it also will not clash with other quests. You're free to think about how to deal with it. Kant nodded. That's more like it. If it were something that clashed with other quests, he would have had to finish it first. It would have been something beyond Kant's current abilities. At this juncture, he still had no way of acquiring more dinar. Even with the path assigned, it was still something beyond him to accomplish. His near-empty remaining capital meant that he would not have had enough funds to pay his forces the following week. He also had run out of developmental funds at the same time. Ding, a trade caravan from Reyvadin is here. A prompt was heard from the system. Kant slightly frowned. A trade caravan from Reyvadin. He felt rather confused. At the northern dune, not far away, a Swadian militia member quickly came waving at them, shouting, "Unknown figures incoming! Unknown figures incoming! Are they here?" Kant frowned and thought about that so-called trade caravan. However, he still told the desert bandits, who were standing by at his side, "Go and check them out." understood. The 16 desert bandits nodded and got onto their horses. They rode straight for the northern dune. It was the Naran desert, after all, so letting one's guard down was a bad idea. However, all desert bandits returned with 3 carriages. Several riders and walking servants followed at a leisurely pace. These foreign people seemed to be having a good time chatting among themselves. It was obvious that they were not the enemy. They gradually arrived at his place. The Swadian militia members, who were in charge of defense on the rooftops of Trondheim, eyed them vigilantly with their hunting crossbows lifted. "My lord, they're here." The desert bandits rode their horses to where Kant was and respectfully reported, "They are a trade caravan from Reyvadin." "Right." Kant nodded. He eyed the 3 carriages. There was 1 leader and 6 escorts, as well as 12 mercenary troops. All of them were members of the trade caravan. He calmed considerably, even though these people wore their weapons out in the open. He knew that they were a trade caravan from the game. The leader of the trade caravan was eloquent. Seeing how all the desert bandits paid respects to Kant, he knew right away that the man before him was the Lord. He quickly shot a look at the 6 escorts, who were riding on their horses. All of them got off their horses and bowed respectfully, saying, "Revered Lord of Swadia, we are a trade caravan from Reyvadin. We hereby offer our sincerest respect to you." Chapter 30, Dates traded for wheat. The trade caravan members behaved rather respectfully toward Kant. Not the slightest hint of rudeness was seen in them. In their subconscious, Kant was like a greater noble from the continent of Caravan, even if he was a Swadian. That status demanded respect even from Swadian nobles, so it went without saying with nobles like those of the trade caravan. Yet, Kant only nodded. His expression remained unchanged. His noble status had been assigned by the system. He turned his gaze behind the caravan. Their goods were all neatly packaged on the 3 carriages. One was easily able to tell that they were packed with items to sell. "It's a pity." Kant sighed deep down. He had no funds to make any purchases. "My lord, these are all specialties brought all the way from Reyvadin." The trade caravan leader smiled and explained, "Our trade caravan sells very affordable wool. We also offer tools, raw iron, and linen cloth, as well as food, such as dried meat, smoked fish, and wheat." He paused and said, "Of course, we buy specialties as well." "You buy specialties?" Kant frowned and asked, "How?" That piqued his interest. Before this caravan arrived, he had no idea that he was able to sell goods to trade caravans. "Yes, we do purchase certain items." The trade caravan leader took a look at the side of the council hall. He eyed the grocery store and said with an interesting expression, "I see that you have an empty store, my lord. If you do not mind, I'm thinking of having my team move the goods over there. We would like to stay here for a week." "All right." Kant nodded. "You have 1 week to do whatever you need to do." He swiftly agreed to it. He had no funds at the moment, so he was unable to buy anything. "Many thanks, my lord." The leader was grateful. He immediately bowed to express his gratitude. The mercenary troops behind him led their carriages over to the grocery store, leaving deep tracks in the sand. It was obvious that all 3 carriages were fully packed. Kant knew that fact deep down. Trade caravans throughout the continent of Caravan followed certain trade routes. Purchases were made in cities along the route at low prices and then sold at high prices, or said goods were accumulated to be ferried back to their cities of origin. That was the basic conduct of commerce. "There's nothing I can sell from this place of mine though." Kant bitterly chuckled to himself. While his place was named Trondheim, it paled in comparison to the real Trondheim on the continent of Caravan. His tiny village was not even self-sufficient. Even if he had help from the system, developing commerce at this stage was an absurd notion. However, he still let the trade caravan do as they pleased. After all, it was a good thing to have more people around the Oasis lookout. Kant shrugged and said in a self-depreciative manner, "At least I now feel less like an outcast in the world." Afterward, he quickly recomposed himself. He walked toward Council Hall. He had some plans regarding that special mission. He soon arrived outside the Council Hall's door and went inside. The Swadian militia member, who stood guard at the door of the Council Hall with his heavy spear in hand, came over to Kant just as he sat down. The militia member respectfully said, "My lord, the trade caravan leader wishes to see you." The Council Hall was not a place that just anyone could enter. "Let him in." Kant nodded. It was obvious that he saw the leader waiting right outside the door. The leader of the trade caravan looked like he was in his 40s. There were some silver hairs by the side of his head, but he still looked rather sprightly. There was no doubt that someone capable of leading a caravan from a city alone was anything but ordinary. In truth, such positions were usually taken by top-class retired soldiers. While the leader was equipped only with a sword and wore scale armor, his proficiency with his weapon and skill on the back of a horse was on par with that of a Swadian knight. However, he behaved unusually meek before Kant. He bowed and hung his head low. "My lord, forgive the intrusion." "It's all right. I'm not busy right now." Kant looked at the leader and asked, "Is there anything you need to discuss?" The leader respectfully replied, "My lord, I see that your village seems to have date palm trees planted. If you have ample stock, we would like to purchase some of the dates." "You want to buy dates?" Kant was dumbfounded. The leader nodded affirmatively and continued, "Indeed, my lord. Dates are a specialty of the Saran Sultanate, and they are delicious. They sell quite well in other countries." "Of course, sure." Kant nodded right away. He had collected over a dozen baskets of the dates the previous week. While they had eaten some since then, there were enough to fill 10 baskets. Kant frowned and asked in return, "Dinars?" The currency of the trade was, of course, dinars. It was the only currency recognized by the system. "Of course." The leader nodded and looked rather curious. He asked, "My lord, would you like to trade those dates for some of our goods? We could barter as well." Of course, the prices of the goods trade would still need to be equal. Kant was slightly puzzled. However, he quickly returned to his senses and said, "No, there is no need for that. Dinars will do fine." "As you wish." The leader felt rather puzzled himself. The leader had no idea that Kant wanted dinars so bad that he was almost unable to think of anything else. He was so desperate that he actually thought of charging into the tribe filled with ferocious primitive creatures and fighting his way through those beasts. He was unable to do anything without dinars. "I need someone around." Kant said to the militia member guarding the door, "Take our friend here to our stores and let them have a look at our freshly dried dates." The militia member nodded. "Understood." The leader excused himself and headed to the storage room at the side of the council hall with the militia member. More than a dozen baskets of dates were stacked there. All of them had just finished being dried under the sun. The dates people usually talked about were the dried end products. Freshly plucked dates had little shelf life to speak of. Sun-dried dates were more well-suited to be stored and carried around in a desert climate. Furthermore, dried dates tasted even sweeter. The leader soon emerged. He was chewing on a date that he carried in his hand. His face had a mesmerized expression. He said, "My lord, these dates are good. They are high-grade stuff." Kant nodded and smiled. He knew that very well. These dates were produced by the system, so they were definitely fine products. Very good indeed. That leader gulped down the rest of the date. He looked at Kant and respectfully said, "If you are willing, I would like to offer 50 dinars per basket for the dates." 50 dinars. Kant frowned. That meant 10 baskets of dates only equaled 500 dinars. Those baskets contained most of the fruits plucked from 20 date palm trees, and they totaled thousands of pounds. The leader shrugged slightly and wore an exasperated expression. "My lord, while the dates do taste good, they are not necessary items. It is actually due to many eating these things in the desert that they are able to fetch a slightly high price. He paused for a bit and continued, if the dates were to be of bad quality, we wouldn't be offering 50 dinars per basket in the first place. Will do. We'll sell them according to the price you offered. Kant wore a calm expression. He looked as if nothing was wrong. He was actually feeling very bitter deep down. He thought that merchants were indeed sly people. If he had any other choice, he would not have wanted to sell those dates. They served as food reserves for his people. You have made a wise decision, the leader said, sucking up to Kant. Kant wore a faint smile and replied, maybe I did. A dinar shortage was his biggest headache at the moment. He had no choice but to sell those dates to maintain his forces. Compared to bread, dates were not that filling despite being very nutritious. Kant suddenly seemed to have realized something. He asked the leader, do you have wheat among your goods? Yes, we do. The leader said, it is 50 dinars for one bag of wheat. You could choose to plant them or grind them down to flour. I want a bag. Kant nodded and said, I'm thinking of planting them. In that case, I shall find you the best bag among the bunch. The leader smiled and said, if you plant them in an oasis, you need to make that the wheat gets enough water. Otherwise, the scorching weather will burn the wheat seedlings. Thank you for the reminder, Kant replied with a smile. The Swadian peasants already knew that. All the mud they dredged up from the pond was to serve as fertilizer for the wheat. It was an act of killing two birds with one stone.